You already knew. Before you said yes. Before you put it off. Before you did it again. There was a moment, small, quick, where you knew this wasn't the right move. And you still did it. Not because you didn't understand. Not because no one told you. You knew. And afterward, there's that familiar feeling. Not confusion. Not surprise. Just a quiet question. Why do I keep doing this, even when I know better? The moment you already know. You've probably had this moment more times than you can count. You're about to do something, and you already know it's not the right move. Not later. Right there. You feel it clearly. You know you should say no, but you say yes, anyway. You know you should start, but you delay it again. You know something doesn't sit right, but you move past it like it doesn't matter. And the strange part is, you're not confused. You're not guessing. You already know. But you still do it. And afterward, there's that familiar feeling. Not shock. Not surprise. Just a quiet realization. I knew that wasn't right. So why did I do it again? That question shows up in small, everyday situations. Not dramatic ones. The kind that repeat so often you almost stop noticing them. You tell yourself you'll do it later, and later never comes. You tell yourself this is the last time, and it isn't. You tell yourself you won't repeat it, and then you do. None of these moments feel serious enough on their own. That's exactly why they're easy to ignore. But something starts happening when they repeat. You begin to notice a gap. A gap between what you know and what you actually do. And the more that gap shows up, the harder it is to ignore. Because it's not about understanding. You understand. It's not about awareness. You're aware. But in the moment, that awareness doesn't seem to change the outcome. And that's where the frustration comes from. Not because you don't know what's right. But because knowing hasn't been enough to change your behavior. Over time, that creates a subtle shift. You start hesitating more than you used to. You second-guess decisions that should feel simple. You replay moments after they happen, thinking about what you should have done instead. And that question starts coming up more often. Why do I keep doing this? Not once. But again and again. And that's when it stops feeling like a one-time mistake. It starts feeling like a pattern. A pattern where you recognize what's right, but don't always follow it. And once you see that pattern clearly, it's hard to pretend it's not there. Because now it's not just something that happens. It's something you're aware of while it's happening. You feel it in real time. That moment where you could choose differently. And still, you don't. That's the part most people don't understand. Not what they're doing. But why, in that exact moment, they continue anyway. Because until that moment makes sense, the pattern doesn't change. And knowing alone isn't what breaks it. Part 2, what actually happens in that moment. If you slow that moment down, you'll notice something important. It's not that you don't know what to do. It's that something else feels easier to follow. Right before you act, there's a brief signal. A hesitation. A small resistance. A feeling that something isn't fully aligned. But that signal is quiet. And something else is louder. The urge to avoid discomfort. The urge to keep things easy. The urge to not deal with what comes next. So instead of following what you know, you follow what feels easier in that moment. And most of the time, that choice reduces tension immediately. You say yes, and the situation moves on. You delay it, and the pressure disappears for now. You ignore it, and nothing has to be addressed. In the short term, it works. That's why it repeats. Because your mind learns quickly. It learns that choosing the easier option removes discomfort right away. And over time, that becomes the default. Not because it's better. But because it's familiar. The person we've been describing starts to notice this more clearly. Not just what they're doing, but what they're avoiding. They're avoiding saying something that might create tension. They're avoiding starting something that feels uncertain. They're avoiding decisions that require effort or clarity. And once they see that, something shifts. Because now it's not just a random behavior. It's a pattern. A pattern of choosing short-term relief over long-term alignment. That pattern explains a lot. It explains why you can know something clearly and still not act on it. It explains why awareness doesn't always lead to change. It explains why the same situations keep repeating. Because in that moment, you're not choosing between right and wrong. You're choosing between what feels easier now and what you know is right. And most people are trained, without realizing it, to choose what feels easier. Not because they lack discipline, but because they've repeated that pattern enough times for it to feel automatic. The more it repeats, the less it feels like a choice. It starts feeling like that's just how things happen. You respond quickly. You move on. You don't question it. Until you start noticing it. And once you notice it, it changes how that moment feels. Because now you can see the trade. You can see that what feels easier now is costing you something later. Clarity. Progress. Trust in your own decisions. And that's when the moment starts feeling different. Not easier. But more visible. Because now, instead of reacting automatically, you can see what's happening while it's happening. And that's where the possibility of doing something different begins. Not because you force it, but because you finally understand what's actually driving the choice. Part 3, what you start doing instead. Once you see what's actually happening in that moment, it changes how you move through it. Not all at once, but enough to notice the difference. Because now, when that situation comes up again, it doesn't feel as automatic. You recognize it faster. You feel that hesitation, and instead of moving past it immediately, you stay with it for a second longer. That's new. Before, everything happened quickly. You reacted. You adjusted. You moved on. Now there's a pause. And that pause is where things begin to shift. Not because you're forcing yourself to change, but because you're no longer moving without seeing it. A simple way to handle that moment is to break it into 3 parts. Not complicated. Just something you can actually use when it happens. You can think of it as pause, pattern, replace. First, pause. When you feel that small hesitation, don't rush past it. You don't have to respond right away. Even a few seconds is enough to interrupt what you usually do. That pause creates space. And without that space, nothing changes. Second, pattern. Instead of focusing only on the situation, recognize what's repeating. Ask yourself, even briefly, what am I about to do that I've done before? You're not trying to solve everything. Just noticing that this isn't new. That you've been here before. That awareness matters, because it separates the moment from the habit. Third, replace. You don't need a perfect response. You just need a different one. Something small. Maybe you don't answer right away. Maybe you say you'll think about it. Maybe you start the task instead of delaying it again. Maybe you say no, even if it feels uncomfortable. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be different from what you usually do. That's what begins changing the pattern. At first, it won't feel natural. You might still go back to what you've always done sometimes. That's expected. Because the goal isn't to get it right every time. The goal is to stop moving through these moments without seeing them. And the more you do that, the more something starts to rebuild. You feel more present in your decisions. You notice things earlier. You hesitate less after the fact, because you've already considered it in the moment. That's where the shift happens. Not in knowing more, but in what you do with what you already know. Because once you start pausing, recognizing, and choosing differently, even in small ways, the gap between knowing and doing begins to close. And when that gap closes, your decisions start feeling more consistent. Not perfect, but aligned. And that's what changes how you experience your own choices. If you think about it, this isn't new to you. You've felt that moment before. That small hesitation, right before you do something you already know isn't right. And most of the time, it passes quickly. You move on. You deal with it later. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. But it adds up. Not all at once. Just enough to notice. You feel it in the way you think after. In the way you replay things. In the way some decisions feel heavier than they should. Not because you didn't know. But because you did. And that's what makes this different. You don't need more information. You don't need someone to tell you what's right. You've already had those moments where you saw it clearly. The difference now is what you do when it happens again. When that hesitation shows up. When that small signal is there. Do you move past it like before? Or do you stay with it for just a second longer? Because that second matters. That's where the pattern either continues or starts to change. And you've probably already experienced both. Moments where you moved past it. And moments where you didn't. And you felt the difference. Not in a dramatic way. But enough to notice. A little more clarity. A little less second guessing. A little more steadiness in your decisions. That's not random. That's what it feels like when what you do starts matching what you already know. And the more that happens, the less this becomes something you think about. And the more it becomes how you naturally respond. Not perfect. But different. And over time, that difference becomes consistent. So the next time that moment shows up, and it will, you'll recognize it. And the question won't be, why does this keep happening? It will be much simpler. What am I going to do with it this time?